Welcome to the Manitoba Ag Days podcast, featuring speakers from our 2017 event. This podcast features Dr. John Gavloski from Manitoba Agriculture, and his talk is entitled, 2 Steps Forward, 1 Step Back, Challenges for IPM in Prairie Agriculture.
Okay, well, thanks. And just start by mentioning my main role is insect control, insect management, and primarily what I try to do is help farmers manage insects in the most economical and sustainable way. There's been a lot of great tools that have come along in the past decades that have made this job a lot easier. Changes in the varieties we use, changes in the chemicals we use, changes in the way we grow crops. Some of these changes make this task easier. There are other changes, though, changes in varieties, changes in farming systems, that do make it more challenging. So, with my presentation, I've got really 4 different goals here. Number 1, I'm going to try to define what IPM is. There's been many definitions used. I will focus on one that I think applies the most. We will look at what the 6 basic components to integrated pest management are. We'll look at some of the success stories, things that have made pest management easier or more economical or better for the environment. And then we'll look at challenges, things that maybe changes that have happened in our system, gaps, things that we need more information on. So we'll conclude with that. So first of all, integrated pest management. The way this got going, back in the 1950s, this was just after the organochlorine insecticides came out, your DDTs, your original insecticides. They were being used widespread across much of North America. There was a lot of resistance starting to develop. And growers and agronomists at that time realized we've got to do something a bit differently. At the same time, you had attempts to introduce biological controls. Problem was, there was such heavy reliance on some of the chemicals at that time, and the broad spectrum chemicals, the biocontrols just weren't doing well. One of the original definitions of IPM, it was actually back then called integrated control. This came out of California. The idea was that chemicals were part of this system, but chemical insecticides were to be used in the manner least disruptive to biocontrol. So that takes us to our current definition. Now, this is a big, long definition from the United Nations. I'm not going to read it all. I'm going to focus on the last paragraph there. IPM emphasizes the growth of a healthy crop with the least possible disruption to agro-ecosystem and encourages natural pest control mechanisms. So that's the definition that is, I guess, more commonly or properly used. Integrated pest management involves many different methods of managing pests, including chemicals, but the chemical controls need to be at least conducive to allowing our biological controls to function. So going out, scouting a field, noting you've got a few aphids, spraying with a broad spectrum product that kills everything, really doesn't fit in line with proper integrated pest management. We need to be looking for ways that we can help preserve those natural controls. So that's the definition that we're going to be using. Now, since the original definitions came along, we've also incorporated not just insects and insect management into this, but also weeds, plant pathogens. So when we do integrated pest management, we have to realize we're dealing with the entire system. A change that we make that might help reduce insect populations might also contribute to increased disease pressure. An example being down here, this is a root maggot in a canola stem. Great research in Alberta by Lloyd Dosdell. He showed that if you seed with reduced row spacing, so higher seeding rates would reduce root maggot pressure. The reason is the root maggots have this funny dance they do around a plant to lay their eggs. They lay fewer eggs, you get less root maggot pressure if you seed with higher seeding rates. Problem is, you get more plant pathogens. So you have to consider the whole system. What is your biggest risk? Is root maggots your biggest risk? Are plant diseases? And use that to make your decisions. So So these are the 6 basic components to integrated pest management. Proper IPM system, you need some form of monitoring for pests. You need acceptable levels for the pests. A couple aphids per plant in most cases isn't a big deal. A few hundred could be. So you need acceptable pest levels. How many is too many? You need different types of control strategies, and there's 4 primary types that we rely on. Cultural controls, that's things like your seeding dates, seeding rates, maybe time of harvest. Things like that are your cultural practices. Mechanical controls, where you're mechanically controlling insects. We don't use them too much in field crops. Biological control, that's all your natural enemies, your predators, your parasitoids, and the responsible use of pesticides. We have to use them in a way that isn't going to jeopardize the use of any of those other control methods. That's proper IPM. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through each of these 6 steps, and I'm going to show you ways that we've improved on these and made gains in the last decades, and then go over where are the challenges in each of these key areas. So with our successes, monitoring and action thresholds. We've had a lot of good work done on this, and in fact, all the examples on this page here, these are all studies from Manitoba. In fact, all from Agriculture Canada in Manitoba. Our Bertha armyworm economic thresholds, that was done back in the 70s, that work, when Bertha armyworm first became a problem. Lygus bugs in canola, good work by Ian Wise and Bob Lamb to first of all develop a good sweep net technique, and then secondly to develop a sequential sampling plan and economic thresholds that we can use. Aphids in flax, that was Bob Lamb, Ian Wise, and some grad students that came up with that threshold. And aphids in peas, again, all Manitoba-derived economic thresholds. And again, with them, good methods of sampling for these insects. So a lot of great research to help us to make good decisions and spray only when sprays are needed. With preventative cultural controls, there's been a lot of advances in the varieties that we grow. We've got, in many cases, resistant varieties that we can use as part of our control strategy. Wheat midge resistant varieties. So when wheat midge becomes an issue, we've got resistant varieties that can be used. Further west in the prairies, where wheat stem sawfly is more of an issue, we do have resistant varieties that are part of that control strategy. And BT corn. When we get into some of the higher cycles of European corn borer, we do have the option of planting BT corn, which is highly effective at helping to control European corn borer. So many great advances in that way. I put corn rootworm down here too. We do have corn rootworm resistant corn varieties. This is a newer insect that we've been seeing in Manitoba. We've only been seeing it in corn that's been in fields that have been in corn for many years in a row. We've been trying to encourage growers, rotate your crops and you won't have this problem, but for those who don't, we do have resistant varieties. So other success stories, seeding dates. The example I've picked here is Hessian fly in wheat. Most of our wheat is seeded early enough that Hessian fly isn't really a big issue here, but if you do seed in the first 2 weeks of June, you increase your risk of Hessian fly. And we usually don't discourage people from seeding late if they're going to do so, but we do caution them that you could have increased risk of Hessian fly. So good research on that. Flea beetles in canola. A couple of different studies here. Hector Carcamo in Alberta, Jan Canola in North Dakota. Jan's study, what she did find was that by seeding earlier, you have a slightly higher risk of higher flea beetle damage than later seeded canola. So that's good knowledge. It doesn't really change what most growers are going to do because you want to seed early so you avoid heat blasting early or later in the summer. So again, it's not really changing what you're going to do, but at least it's helping you evaluate your risks. So you know that if flea beetles have been a problem, we need our seed treatments and we need to be scouting for flea beetles. And seeding rates, I've already mentioned our root maggot example. Higher seeding rates equal less root maggots. Biological controls. There's been a lot of advances in this area. And I've just highlighted a few examples. So what you see down here, this is an insect called cereal leaf beetle, and this is a small larva that feeds on wheat leaves. It's newer in Manitoba. It's only been here within the last decade. It's been spreading across the province. And areas where it's not contained by biological control, it can be a highly economical pest. So far, it hasn't been that way in Manitoba. And what happened here was when we first found cereal leaf beetle in Manitoba, a colleague of mine in Lethbridge was rearing a parasitic wasp, that's this guy here, called Tetrastitius julis. And this wasp is really, really good at finding cereal leaf beetles in the field, laying its eggs into them, and the wasp larva lives inside the cereal leaf beetle larva, ends up killing it. And we started doing releases of this parasite as soon as we found cereal leaf beetle in the province. In follow-up studies, it seems the wasp is taking quite well and seems to be containing it in most areas. So we're trying to keep this going where every time we find a new population, we bring in some more wasps and we release them in that new population, try to contain it. So I encourage people, if cereal leaf beetle is showing up in your area, let me know and we can try to look at getting some biocontrol releases done. And I should mention, I use the word wasp. This wasp only attacks cereal leaf beetle. It doesn't sting you and it doesn't attack other things. Here's another one, Aphidius smithii. So this one here, they're tiny wasps as well. They're released back in the 80s for aphid control. Aphidius target aphids, hence the name Aphidius. These wasps are very good. They're specialized at finding aphids, laying eggs into them. And what you end up with is a corpse of an aphid on the plant with a hole in the back of it where the wasp would have emerged. Macrogleans penetrans. This is the one that attacks wheat midge. When wheat midge first became a problem, we knew very little about this parasitoid. Now we know a lot more, and we know that in a lot of years, half to 3/4 of your wheat midge can be killed by this parasitoid. So it's highly effective, and we right now encourage growers, if you aren't above economic thresholds for wheat midge, sometimes you're better off just leaving the situation alone, letting macrogleans do the work for you. By doing spraying when it's not needed, you could interrupt the cycles and get into a cycle where you have to be controlling wheat midge because you've taken out the biocontrols. So they can be highly effective. Other success stories, responsible use of pesticides. And I've got a couple examples here. Bran baits. For grasshoppers, the rural municipalities often do grasshopper control programs in the ditches and areas outside of fields. The last few times they've had to do this, mainly what they've been using is a product called EcoBran. And what they've done with EcoBran is they've taken a chemical, carbaryl, which is normally broad spectrum, kills everything. They've put it on a bran bait. They've put an attractant to grasshoppers on the bait. So really the only things that are going to be killed by this chemical are grasshoppers, possibly crickets, and maybe the odd ground beetle or something that might nibble on the bait. But most of your parasites, most of your predators won't be killed. So they've taken a general product and made it so that it's more targeted. So good advancement there in insect control technology. Another advancement is something called reduced area and agent treatments. This is research out of Wyoming, and what they've done there is they were doing experiments where they were spraying grasshoppers in rangeland, but they were only treating in strips. They would treat 30 meters of crop, leave 30 untreated, treat the next 30 goes untreated, so they're doing this treatment in strips. What they found was that their grasshopper control was nearly identical in the plots where they had used this reduced area and agent treatment versus spraying the whole rangeland. The reason being grasshoppers move around. So they're moving from untreated plots into treated plots, getting killed. So your control, if anything, it may go down a few percentage points and that's it. So economically, the rangeland producers were much better off ahead using this system of controlling grasshoppers. So you're still using the same chemicals, you're just using them more effectively, and those unsprayed strips would preserve some of the natural enemies that are helping to control the grasshoppers. So we can use chemicals possibly in better ways to help preserve some of our natural enemies. And here's something out of New York State, environmental impact quotients. And what they've done at Cornell University is, this is more for horticulture, but they've taken basically all the chemicals that they use in their hort production, all the pests they use, figured out the rates, and for each pest insecticide combination, they've produced something called an environmental impact quotient. So any grower who, say, is spraying an orchard or something, wants to minimize the harm to natural enemies, they can look up what the environmental impact quotients are and try to use that as a guideline to help them spray more effectively and reduce harm to natural enemies. So now, those are success stories. Now the challenges. And there's quite a few of them, and a lot of them stem from changes in the way we produce our crops. First of all, monitoring. And I'm going to use lygus bugs in canola as my example. So I mentioned earlier that Ian Wise and Bob Lamb, they developed an economic threshold for lygus bugs in canola. When they developed that threshold, they were able to easily walk into a canola field, take a sweep net, walk through the field, do their sweeping, count their lygus bugs. So great threshold, good technique. Problem is, canola has changed. When they did that research, you could easily walk through a canola field. The varieties are about this high. You could easily walk through, do your sweeping. Nowadays, you get a good growing season. Your canola might be this high, and trying to do sweeping becomes very difficult. So our varieties have changed. The crop is just a lot more dense, and probably a lot of people who have tried using a sweep net in canola in that late flowering, early potting stage will agree that some fields it's very difficult using your net. So the researchers do realize we may have to adapt new techniques for monitoring lygus bug just because our varieties of canola have become that much more dense, lush, and harder to do this scouting in. The other thing, too, I'd like to mention, we've had great successes in trapping things like Bertha armyworm, diamondback moth. We put up these pheromone-baited traps. That pulls the pests in. We count them, and we can forecast risk based on using these traps. Now, the problem is you need to interpret the data from these traps properly, or you could end up making false decisions and sometimes doing more harm than good. So the trap we have here, this is for Bertha armyworm. And we put up a number of these traps across the province every year. We do our counts, we produce forecast maps. So the way this trap works, it only pulls in the males, for one. The pheromone is only attracted to the males. The females, the ones laying the eggs, they don't care about the trap. What draws them to a field is the stage of the crop. So we can have a trap in a field that collects a lot of males, but that field may not get a lot of eggs laid in it. So the traps really do nothing about telling us what the risk is in that field. But if we get a number of traps in a region with high counts, regionally we can anticipate we probably will have some fields that are above the economic threshold. It's hard to tell what those fields are because a lot depends on crop staging and what the stage of the crop is when the females are laying the eggs. So again, the field the trap is in, it doesn't really tell you anything about that field. So we have to use this data with caution. We've seen situations where the fields with the traps have next to no larvae, yet a field across the road has a lot. And it's all due to crop staging. So great technology has become available to help us monitor insects, but we have to know how to analyze the data properly. Otherwise, you can make false spray decisions. Thresholds for insects. There's a term here I'm using called dynamic action thresholds. So most of our economic thresholds, you go out, you count the pest, and you make a spray decision. Problem is, there's a lot happening in a field, and a lot of times you have natural enemies also in that field, and whether or not that spray is going to be beneficial or not may depend on what those natural enemy levels are like. And I'll give you an example, soybean aphids. You can watch soybean aphid levels climb from 50 to 200 to 300 in a field. If you don't have a lot of natural enemies, you could have a linear progression in your population of soybean aphids. If you have enough natural enemies, you may get an initial buildup and then the population may plateau. It may plateau at a level where you do not need to spray it. The problem is sometimes you do not know that unless you can be sampling those natural enemies as well. So for soybean aphids, they've actually done this. They figured out what the natural enemies actually mean, and they've been able to figure out formulas where you can take your aphid numbers, enter in your natural enemy numbers, so your lady beetles, lacewings, pirate bugs, and with a little bit of weather data, figure out and help fine-tune your decision making. There's actually something called, it's an app called Aphid Advisor, and you can get that on your cell phone, and you can input your data, and it'll help you do all this. So we've got some great technology this way to help us fine-tune our economic thresholds. Problem is, we don't have enough of these economic thresholds that incorporate natural enemies. Right now, we are researching one for aphids and cereals. We're probably a few years away, though, from having that so that you are actually counting the natural enemies and using that in your decision making. And biopesticides, this is another thing I'll mention. I was at a talk in the fall, and they were talking about some of the fungal and botanical insecticides that are out there, especially the fungal and bacterial-based ones. You have to apply those to the pests really before the pests start getting established. You have to hit them early. Now, most of our economic thresholds have been based on the fact that you're scouting an established population and you are basically spraying a population that's already developed. So with biopesticides, the thinking is a little bit different. We may have to adjust our economic thresholds probably down a bit if we're to use that mentality that you spray insects earlier on. And as well, we don't have proper economic thresholds for a lot of insects. Diamondback moth. So we do have a threshold, 20 to 30 diamondback moth per foot square of plants. That's the threshold we usually tell you to use. There really isn't any good quantitative data to back up that threshold. What basically happened was diamondback moth was becoming a problem. We knew we had economic populations. People needed some guidelines, something to guide them. Well, how many is too many? There was no data, so entomologists created a threshold. It's basically an entomologist's best guess based on available information. In case of diamondback moth, it's what we call a nominal threshold. It's our best guess, but I don't have data that we could back up that threshold. Nobody does. I can't find you a publication to back that up. So we need a proper economic threshold for diamondback moth. Most entomologists nowadays think that they kind of ballparked a bit too low. Probably the threshold should be a bit higher than it really is, but again, we don't have data to prove that. So we do need that research to be done. Cutworms. Often we will use a threshold 3 to 4 per square meter. That's, again, that's a nominal threshold. It's our best guess. We don't have data to back that up. Grasshoppers, same thing, 8 to 12 per meter square. That's the nominal threshold. And wireworms. This is a tricky one because there's been a lot of political debate about wireworms and neonicotinoid insecticides. And in places like Ontario, they're mandating people to scout for wireworms and prove they've got a problem before they can use a seed treatment with an insecticide. Problem is, we don't have economic thresholds for wireworms, and the attempts at creating them are basically guesses. So for anybody who is considering a career in entomology, there's a lot of research that needs to be done developing proper economic thresholds. So preventive cultural controls. One of the things that we know is that natural enemies need habitat, and a lot of our farms have been getting bigger, and we've actually been reducing the amount of natural habitat in and around a lot of our farms. And this can become a problem because, again, natural enemies do need a place to reside. And there's a good review paper that came out of McGill University, and they were looking at landscape structure and natural enemy abundance. And anyway, a couple of their conclusions is that diversity, so diversity can be expected on average to give rise to ecosystem stability. So the more plants, the more insects you have on a farm, ironically enough, equals a more stable system. And we're talking not just bulk numbers, but species numbers. The more plant species, the more insect species, the more stable the system, the fewer outbreaks. That was sort of the biological principle that emerged from most of these studies in this review. So invasions most frequently occurred on cultivated land where human influence had produced greatly simplified ecological communities. So bottom line, more diverse plant environment, whether that's crops, shelter belts, wild areas around the farm, equals more stable systems, fewer outbreaks. So that's one of our challenges. How do you create such a system on the farm when you're trying to produce big blocks of land to create an income? So we can look at things like intercropping, again, shelter belts. In Europe, they do something called beetle banks. This is quite common, where they essentially have a strip of either wild or land that they've developed into a strip that runs through their field that's basically a reservoir for natural enemies. A lot of times they're just wild strips that run through the fields to help preserve natural enemies, called beetle banks. Shelter belts, again, can help increase our diversity on our farms and good for keeping a lot of natural enemies hanging around. This is a slide here from the U.S. Corn Belt. If you go into Iowa, Nebraska, some of those states, you'll often see crops. So here we've got intercropping of barley, soybeans, and corn. And so you've got the three crops growing side by side, your barley, your soybeans, your corn. And they just have strips like this. And again, the theory is that by having several crops on a piece of land instead of just plain corn or plain barley, you increase your diversity of plants. You've probably got a very different insect community in that situation than you would in, say, a pure corn environment. So on average, overall, more stable system, hopefully less pest control intervention needed. So by the way, that's called strip intercropping, commonly used in the Corn Belt. And I know it has something that has been researched up here. So another big challenge for integrated pest management is recognition of natural enemies. So the last few years, people were seeing a lot of these appearing on their wheat heads. And I was getting calls saying, what are these eggs? And is this something we're going to have to control? So first of all, they're not eggs. They are pupa clusters of a parasite. And so this is a parasite here. It's called Cotesia, the parasitic wasp. What this parasite does is it is very good at finding armyworms. We had armyworm issues the last 2 or 3 years. Mainly the first generation armyworm. The second generation really wasn't that big. And what was happening was these Cotesia were finding them, laying their eggs into the armyworms. And what happens, Cotesia eggs, one egg inside an armyworm starts multiplying, and you will often get dozens and sometimes even hundreds of Cotesia larvae living in one armyworm. And I'd be bringing these caterpillars back to my office at work, and we'd be watching sometimes when the larvae start coming out. Because they all come from one egg, you get sometimes dozens or even hundreds of parasite larvae emerging from one armyworm all at the same time. It's actually pretty cool to watch. But anyway, we had huge Cotesia populations the last couple of years, so people were really noticing a lot of these pupa cases on top of their wheat heads. Problem is, people aren't recognizing them as a good thing. And same with the adult wasps. If you take a sweep net and go through a field of, say, canola or wheat or something, and you have a lot of black specks in there, a lot of people like to call them flies or just don't recognize what they are. These are good things. They're the things that are keeping your pests in check. You want those in your fields. Problem is, there's a recognition problem. And it's easy enough to teach people how to identify predators. Parasitoids are much tougher. So here's a predator here, fairly common predator. Any guesses what this one here is? This is our audience participation part. This is a ladybug. This is a larva of a ladybug. The lady beetles start out as alligator-like black things. Later they become your adult orange or red ladybug. But even something like this, people often struggle with. So as extension people, that's one of our challenges, trying to make it easy for you as farmers and agronomists to know what are the good guys and what are the potential pests. And again, easier for the predators, much tougher for the parasitoids. So something that we have to work on. Responsible use of pesticides. Again, this can be a challenge. again, the way pesticides are marketed can make a difference. We do have pesticides that are selective, that say you get an aphid problem, we do have products that are specific to aphids. But often they are not the pesticides that are, I guess, the cheapest or most convenient for a farmer to use. And part of the problem is oftentimes when you are buying your inputs, you are buying things as packages in bulk. So you might be involved in some sort of pesticide bundle where because you bought certain herbicides, you now have to use this insecticide to control your aphids. So now there's certainly advantages to pesticide bundling. It can be cheaper for you in the long run. The downside to that is it locks you into using certain products, which may not always be the best for the given situation. Tank mixes, I always caution people, I think tank mixes can be a really good thing. They can be efficient, but don't just be dumping in an insecticide because it's cheap and you're already going over the field. I've had several times farmers call me and say, a chem rep told us we're applying a sclerotinia spray, we should just be dumping in an insecticide because there might be some lygus bug or diamondback moth in there. We're already going over the field, it's cheap, it can't do any harm. My comeback to that is it can do harm because canola, although you can get a good canola yield without pollinators, you get a better yield with pollinators, sometimes 10 to 15% better. So if you don't have a legitimate insect problem and you just tank mix in that insecticide just because it's cheap and you're going over the field, you could be inadvertently reducing your yield and losing money. So as IPM, what we try to encourage people to do with IPM is scout, know what you've got, and only use the insecticides if you've got a population above a threshold. Otherwise, you could be inadvertently decreasing your yields. As far as products go, I won't spend a terrible amount of time on this table, but what I'm trying to do here is show you where we do have insecticides that are a bit more selective to targeted pests. So the way this works, anything in green means that we have a pesticide selective to that order. So for aphids, Fulfill is an aphicide. Kills aphids, not much else. Same with Belief. Bold text means that it's registered in field crops. So Belief, we have it registered in potatoes and alfalfa, kills aphids and nothing but aphids. So we do have some more selective products. The problem is you'll notice there's a lot of categories here wide open. If you have a beetle problem, say you've got flea beetles or cereal leaf beetle or something like that, we've got no products specific to beetles. Sorry, I'm using scientific names here. Coleoptera is beetles. There is nothing specific to beetles. If you have caterpillars, we do have a few products. Dipel, which horticulture they use a lot. It targets just caterpillars, will not kill parasitic wasps and predators. So it's a good product. Coragen is not totally selective. It will kill some other insects, some of our predators, but it is semi-selective. It doesn't kill parasitic wasps, bees, things like that. Again, has marginal effect on some predators. Very good on Lepidoptera, so I put it in this category because, again, it's semi-selective. And it's a good option if you're trying to kill something like diamondback moth, Bertha armyworm. It's also good on grasshoppers, but leaves at least the parasitic wasps alone, so that's a good thing. You'll notice here Diptera. Diptera is your flies. We have nothing specific to flies. So flies meaning your wheat midge and mosquitoes. If anyone ever came up with a chemical that killed nothing but flies, mosquitoes, wheat midge, things like that, they'd be a millionaire quickly. So there's a challenge for anybody in the chemical industry. Find us a Diptera-only insecticide. You will be rich. We will have fewer mosquitoes, fewer wheat midge, and more natural enemies. And so I'm going to end here with a bit of a wish list of products that already are out there, but we're not using in field crop agriculture in the prairies because the products just aren't registered for these purposes, or we still have research that is needed. The first one I'm going to mention is a fungus called Metarhizium. So Metarhizium is a fungus that kills grasshoppers and nothing but grasshoppers. And there are different strains of it. In Africa, when they have locust outbreaks, they have a product there called green mussel. Green mussel kills locusts, grasshoppers, not much else. They're currently using that in Africa. And same with Australia. This similar name anyway in Australia for their locust outbreaks. Problem is, it's a different strain of the fungus here in North America. They're still doing the research. They've actually done the research to show that it works, and it works well. You can spray this fungus across a field, and within a week, your grasshopper population is highly significantly less. Works very well, but it just hasn't been commercialized yet. So I think we're close on this one. I'm hoping that we see a product down the road. It would be a real good investment in grasshopper control, especially for some of our early season roadside control that the municipalities do. It would be a really good product for stuff like that. Confirm. Confirm is a product called tebuconazide. It kills Lepidoptera, so caterpillars, moth larvae, and pretty much nothing else. They're currently using this in forestry for things like your spruce budworm. They can use it for, there's a version called Mimic that they can use for things like tent caterpillars. Problem is we don't have an agricultural version to this. So it'd be nice to have sort of a version of this that we could use for, say, earth armyworm, diamondback moth, green cloverworm, any of our caterpillar pests. It's on my wish list anyway. Aphicides. So, aphicides are things that kill nothing but aphids. We do have a few registered. There's Fulfill, registered in potatoes, Belief, registered in potatoes and alfalfa seed. These both work quite well. When you spray a crop with either Fulfill or Belief, aphids stop feeding. They don't die immediately, they stop feeding immediately. And eventually your aphid population dies out. So they're very effective. Problem is they're being targeted for the horticulture markets. So if you're a field crop producer, you just don't have these available. So if you get aphids in your cereal crops, you're probably spraying dimethoate, which kills everything. In your peas, it's probably Matador or dimethoate, which again kills pretty much everything. Flax, dimethoate's your only option. We need aphicides registered in some of our field crops. So for any chemical company reps, those are on my wish list. Baits for cutworm control. We do have brand baits that control grasshoppers. Those same brand baits with a little bit of tinkering could be manufactured to control cutworms. There are products registered in the US, cutworm control products that are baits. We don't have them here. So it may not always be practical because you would need a bait spreader to use these products, but that technology could be developed fairly easily if we wanted to. And I've got one more on my wish list here, a product called Novidor BT tenebrionis. So this is a bacteria that kills only beetles. There was good research done showing that it did work quite well, and we actually did have a product registered in Manitoba briefly called Novidor. Problem is, I don't think the market was big enough and the product kind of disappeared on us, but it might be worth revisiting something like Novidor, and maybe not just for potato beetles, but for some of our other beetle pests as well. So that's on my wish list. So I'm going to end with that, and I think we've probably got about 5 minutes if we've got questions or discussion.
Thanks for listening. We'll see you at Manitoba Ag Days 2018 from January 16th to 18th.